Thanks very much. And apologies in advance for reading from a laptop, but I didn't have time to print my talk before I came to this. So I imagine everyone in the room is familiar with the life and work of Raphael Samuel. You know, probably in many ways more than I am. Maybe you knew him personally, or saw one of his notoriously revelatory, or perhaps slightly chaotic lectures. So I won't do too much by way of introduction before we kind of begin. But I wanted today to talk firstly about what the aim was in putting together this collection, this new volume, which is this here. First and most obvious of those aims was to help to communicate the importance of Raph's historical work to a new generation of readers, those of my generation and younger, perhaps never got a chance to experience his influence directly. I also want to take some of the emphasis away from the heritage debates of the 1980s and 1990s and the reception of his work, and focus more on his historical scholarship, so far mainly collected, like the essays in this volume. But I also wanted to talk about the particular form and the origins of the particular form of people's history that Raphael Samuel champions. And I'm going to do that by taking you through a few scenes from Raph's life. The first from late on, in the early 1990s. The rest from much earlier than that, mainly the late 1950s and early 1960s. So I hope by doing this I achieve both those goals. So the first, there is a video of Raphael Samuel, one of the most remarkable of that generation, of historians within the British left in the late 20th century did so much to determine a historical conception in Britain. Sitting in a characteristically book-filled room, his unruly mop of thick black hair pushed across the crown of his head, discussing the drama of British history. The recording, short but only a minute and a half long, is now on YouTube, and it's one of only a handful of surviving recordings of that famously captivating lecture. If you want to understand Britain between the wars, he says, his eyes bright with enthusiasm and attentiveness, then something like the ballroom dancing craze of the 1920s, or the rambling craze, or the cycling craze, he says, is equally as important as the major political shifts of those decades. By taking seriously and understanding such fleeting national enthusiasms, everything from sunbathing to cycling, as the raw material of history, not only can we understand the changing relationship between people and nature, or between people and work, but perhaps we can see something new in the drama of history. History from below, he says, is, quote, at least as dramatic as history from above. I absolutely refuse the idea that the Treaty of Utrecht, interesting though it is, I don't know if that is particularly interesting, but as interesting as though that is, represents, as it were, the high point of national drama. Such was his thoroughly democratic historical vision. But more than that, history, according to him, was far too important to be left to professional historians alone. So Theatres of Memory was the only sole-authored book he published in his lifetime, and it's a thrilling, often labyrinthine text. And it's a study of those sources of unofficial memory that for most people constitute their historical consciousness. Historians who spend their lives writing specialised texts, often read by none but the accredited few, have at best a walk on part. The book's joy comes as much from following the unexpected detours and new connections as from the central argument. It's also, as Bill Schwartz remarks in his preface to the second edition, an open text, a self-consciously open text. Samuel Schwartz works to minimise at every point the gap between the author and the printed word, and between the printed word and the reader. His vast erudition and the depth of historical understanding was not used to build new, professionalised historical structures, but to tear them down. There was an animating spirit of this work. It was a deep faith in the ability and necessity of ordinary people to become the custodians of their own histories. His mission, therefore, was nothing less than democratising historical knowledge. History, he wrote, in the hands of a professional historian, is apt to present itself as an esoteric form of knowledge. It is a discipline that, with all its ranking claims to historical specialism, to scientific specialism, and in the hands of its ensconced elite, forgets as much as it remembers. It serves to enclose knowledge behind thick walls of academic apparatus. The professional's view of knowledge is a hierarchical one. Knowledge flows downwards from its practitioners to, if they are lucky, an inner public at large. And what counts as history, and who counts as a historian, is radically curtailed in that vision. So his aim in Theatre of the Memory is to disrupt that hierarchy in some way. But I think there's also a real tension here in this, and it's something that I wanted to try and bring out with the volume itself. History may be enthralled to all manner of arcane questions and occult knowledges, the Kabbalah, he says, of acronyms, abbreviations and signs that typify the discipline's professionalisation and signal to the lay reader its off-putting specialism, along with its dense thickets of footnotage and fetishisation of archive-based research. But these are occult methods to which Samuel himself was an adept. Samuel may have sought to democratise and deprofessionalise the production of historical knowledge, but as the essays in his collection show, the depth and breadth of his own historical writing shouldn't be forgotten either. And I think perhaps at times it is slightly overlooked. So the next scene I want to describe is further back, far earlier in Raph's life, and it came in the years around 1956. A great crisis year for the communist left, both in Britain and in more or less every other country with a communist presence. A few years before that, in September 1952, Raph left the progressive King Alfred School in Hampstead to attend Balliol College on a scholarship, where he read history under Christopher Hill, among others. There's a discussion he had with Brian Harrison, the historian, in his house in Elder Street in Spitalfields in 1987, where he said that the sole reason for him applying to Oxford, and to Balliol in particular, was to study with Hill. He said he didn't apply for anywhere else, he just applied for Balliol, and before that had planned to attend I actually can't remember which the university was, but a university in London, a polytechnic. 2 years earlier, he had been taken to several meetings of the Communist Party Historians Group by his history teacher at King Alfred's, who he describes as a secret communist called John Hanford. He said that Hanford, when he was interviewed to join King Alfred's, was asked directly, "Are you a communist?" and he denied it. Apparently he was actually a Communist Party member, though. Says something about the kind of Cold War atmosphere at the time. At the CP Historians Group, he says to Harrison he had been thrilled to go and see these gods, people like Hill, along with Rodney Hilton and A.L. Morton. They're the three that he mentions in particular. And he'd long followed their work in the pages of the Daily Worker. Yet despite the mentorship of Hill and Hill is a kind of another party member, the atmosphere for the young communist at Oxford, he said, was hostile, and he found the intellectual climate of the college cold. As he told Harris in a separate interview in the 1970s, the majority of his time at Oxford was spent, at least initially, quote, as a political activist, as a communist, helping to revive the moribund Oxford Labour Club, as well as organising with the university branch of the CPGB. He viewed his student years, he said, as an interregnum between his childhood and his later life in the party, doing party work. The view of history he had at the time was therefore one set by questions of Marxism as it was viewed by the Communist Party. He said it was, quote, terribly ideological. Obviously, this is him saying this in the 70s and 80s, so there's work to be done kind of interpreting this material. But he said it was terribly ideological. It was to resolve the question of the revolutionary break with feudalism. It was essentially around a Marxist problematic. Laws of development of capitalism was what the CP Historians Group was about. That's a quote from Raph. It was only after he left Oxford and had stopped being a student, he said, that he really got interested in history as research rather than his interpretation, and particularly as kind of archival research. Whilst at Oxford, he took a year's break from study. He went down to do party work in London. And he graduated eventually in the summer of 1956 with a first-class degree. He says he only really managed to do that in his final year. He only really properly applied himself in his final year. He'd earlier failed his prelims, and he says the main reason for the year's break, as well as doing party work, was that because he was failing. He said he hadn't done any serious work, except on, quote, bastard feudalism. But once he returned to Balliol and he graduated, he says it set his sights on becoming a communist organiser. Obviously, events in Eastern Europe were to intervene. The secret speech was given in late February, and by mid-March the news had begun to trickle through to the British press. By November, the crisis in the party became more acute again as Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. By the end of 1958, around 10,000 people, Samuel himself, had left the party in protest. Barely a month after the events in Hungary, Samuel, alongside friends and comrades from Oxford, Gabriel Pearson, Stuart Hall and Charles Taylor, founded the University and Left Review, which was then to merge 2 years later with the New Reasoner to found NLR, which Raph continued to play an editorial role in until 1963, when under severe financial constraints and mounting internal pressure, the original NLR editorial board, then at the time led by Stuart Hall, was replaced by a new collective under a young historian fresh from Oxford, Perry Anderson. Samuel edited one transitional issue of the journal in early 62, which was published characteristically late and massively over length, and that was between Hall's resignation and Anderson's appointment. The early 1960s was something of a political caesura. Into this, many expected or hoped to see a new political generation emerge. But the cumulative effects of the political and personal crisis that began in 1956 began to take their toll. Samuel experienced a deep crisis of confidence and, later, a near breakdown. By 1963, following a severe bout of political disenchantment, he left Britain for Ireland, where he hoped to find refuge and the freedom to write history and poetry, even hoping, he later told Alison Light, to become Irish. And I actually don't know what that means, but that's apparently what he said. But Samuel's stay in Ireland was a significant one. Although he found little work in Dublin and often went hungry for lack of money, it was not a stay without reward. The research rekindled his passion for history and set the tone for much of his later work. These years also saw the germination of his particular historical and educational philosophy. Now, I want to highlight in particular 3 letters that Raph wrote around this time to his family. And I think in those letters, these 3 kind of quite personal letters, you can see the first fruits of this historical thinking begin to emerge. I think so far I've tried to sketch a few of the things that help these fruits to germinate. His early communism being one, as well as the influence of progressive education during the war years and after, and also his work in the New Left in the late 1950s. But I think there's a few others I should mention as well. Firstly, there's his family, particularly his uncle Shimon Abramsky, and secondly, his work interviewing working class families in London's East End, as well as working class Tories in South London, I think in Clapham, and some in the outer suburbs of London. I think in Newtown, I think it's Stevenage was the main one. And that was from Michael Young's Institute for Community Studies, where he was working at the same time as he was producing University and Left Review and then into the New Left Review as well. Anyway, to the letters. So the first one, Samuel wrote to his mother, I think in some point in 1964. It's undated, but I think it was 64. So not long after he returned from London to Dublin. To London from Dublin. When we were students, Samuel writes, we were terribly underground and polite, and traditional learning seemed absolutely dominant. What was needed, he wrote, was for this academic caste of learning to be broken with. Whether one looks at it in history or sociology or, astonishingly, in English literature, it shows the same ineffable signs. Always one is presented with a great screen of obfuscation. Subjects approach so indirectly that it's the critical mind at work that matters, rather than the experience or the text itself. End quote. I think so much of his writing and his teaching was to be conducted in order to remove such a screen from from experience and also from those of his students. The aim was to approach the material directly, however you do that. And it's an attempt to uncover something of the quality of life and experience as it was lived. In the often acrimonious and painful aftermath of the first who left, I think you can see the making of Raphael Samuel, the historian. Around the same time, Sheila Rowbotham first encountered Samuel at a lecture he delivered on the famine in Ireland, given shortly before he left for London, or shortly after. It's unclear exactly what the dates are. Rowbotham at this time was a student at St Hilda's College, Oxford. And she writes that the lecture was revelatory. It's a longer quote from her. The tall, skinny, dark figure with a lock of black hair falling persistently over his nose had a hypnotic aspect. Raphael kept shifting papers from one great pile to another across the table, and, like spectators at Wimbledon, we watched them go faster and faster as his time ran out. His talk was a devastating tour de force, in which he described how belief in free trade and opportunism had combined. The Irish working class, particularly those who made the move across the Irish Sea in the years after that devastating act of colonial violence, were to become one of Raff's paradigmatic outsiders. A key figure, along with gypsies, travellers, and other plebeian comers and goers, in his historical imagination. So I think we can add here into that list of formative influences Ireland as well. And I think it's something that I don't think many people have really commented on quite a lot of his work. And one of the essays in particular in this collection is on the Irish Catholic poor in Britain. And I think there's material there that can kind of have a slightly different look at Raff's work later from that angle. So the second letter I mentioned comes from a bit later, from 1966. Again, it's written to his mother, this time from a Cheshire record office. So I'll quote from that. It is often the most ordinary things which are the most difficult to rescue from oblivion, he wrote. And that's one reason why history sometimes seems to be a thing quite on its own, with its own kind of subject and reality, revolutions, constitutions, epic heroes, which have little in connection with everyday life, and therefore can't be used as part of the evidence on which we try to work out a philosophy of life and of society. You have to work against the grain and bias of the documents to find the material. So simple a thing I find in my work as, for example, a man crossing himself, or keeping sacred pictures in his parlour, or meeting his fellows, or quarrelling in a pub, is infinitely more difficult to find than the exquisite points of political controversy and alignment. Yet obviously, for an understanding of the way in which people lived, of what people are, vastly more important. And I think, that from 1966, you could take that more or less, you could add that more or less into any of the essays in this collection, similarly into Theatres of Memory, and it would fit incredibly well, almost seamlessly. And I think you can see this continuation, this continuity in his thinking right from that moment before he was really publishing historical work into the 90s. So during this period, roughly from the mid-1960s to the end of the 1970s, Samuel's work bore the strong and obvious influence of the discipline of social anthropology. The essay on the Catholic poor I mentioned just now opens with a reflection on, quote, the changing balance of intimacy and unease shared between a Soho Catholic congregation and its priest, Father Sheridan, who at the weekly meeting of St. Bridget's Confraternity recites comic stories of Irish life, designed, he admits, to excite the risible qualities of the women. This relationship between clergy and congregation, Samuel writes, social anthropology may explain. But the historian, lacking evidence, quote, can do little more than record. an earlier essay on the village of Headington Quarry on the outskirts of Oxford. There's an early version of that Headington Quarry essay in this collection. The bigger essay, which is in the Village Life and Labour book, is fantastic if you haven't read it already. I tried to include it, and I typed it up and transcribed it. It's like 100,000 words long. It's as long as the rest of the essays in the volume put together and then some. So sadly, it couldn't be used this time. So I've used the shorter one from an early version of, I think, the second issue of Oral History Journal that's in there. It's kind of an outline of the main arguments. But that essay pushed the anthropological approach further, drawing on living memory, oral testimony, to show village community as a whole way of life. Obviously, Samuel wasn't the only historian to turn to anthropology for inspiration at this time or after. A few years before this, 1963, Keith Thomas, another student of Christopher Hill, published his essay in Past and Present on the conjuncture of the two subjects. And he in there quotes R.H. Tawney from 30 years before that, who said that historians have to turn to anthropology and acquaint themselves with anthropologists to broaden their vision. Around the same time, actually published the same year as Samuel's essay, was Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, where there's a strong influence of social anthropology from a very different political perspective. Peter Laslett's The World We Have Lost also came out 2 years later. So there's an anthropological moment, I think, in history at that point. In the interviews with Harrison, Samuel also mentions the influence of Irving Goffman's study of total institutions in asylums. And Samuel's continuing focus on the concrete in particular shows a clear line of influence from such work, from the work of social and historical anthropologists. Also, at the same time, I think it's maybe his first or second course that he taught at Ruskin. Raph taught a course on social anthropology, and the reading list still it's survived in the archive, and it's Goffman, but it's mainly Evans Pritchard and a few of the other kind of early pioneers of social anthropology that make up the reading list. It's a pretty extensive reading list. It covers a lot of ground. Now, the third letter that I mentioned, this one written to his father, Barnet Samuel, also in 1966, testifies to the kind of effect that the infusion of anthropology had on his work. But I think it also shows the genesis of History Workshop from his work he was doing with his students this period. So I'm going to quote a bit longer this one, but I'll quote from that now. Both the first and second year history people are turning in first class material which they've dug up in local reference libraries over the holiday period. And this makes the history seminars really creative work. Certainly it's encouraging the first year people to see that history isn't something you dig out of textbooks and secondary work, however scholarly, but it's something which you can make for yourself if you're ready to do the work. It is marvellous the confidence with which people read papers on what they really know and are familiar with, the historical and social character of their community. And it serves as a very natural basis for many of the most important themes of 19th century history. The sociology is also quite radically improved from the injection of anthropology and folk culture. I've got one excellent folk singer, a miner, who's been admirably fusing his own interests with some of the anthropological stuff. And the seminar discussions and tutorial essays are always about real things: family, community, popular religion, social solidarity, aggression, prejudice. It also puts up a lot of valuable questions to the historian. And I think the letter gives a sense not only of Samuel as a teacher, but also of his work more generally. In the words of Sally Alexander, another one of his early students of his at Ruskin, his teaching was life-changing. This is a quote from Sally: "I learned everything from Raphael, though he scarcely taught so much as encouraged, engaged in conversation, led us to the libraries and the archives." So I hope some of these influences and some of these separate strands are evident in this collection. I think they are, in my opinion, some of the finest pieces of historical writing produced in Britain in the late 20th century. And I'm delighted to have had a hand in bringing them to a wide readership, and I hope you'll kind of see them in the whole, when read together, they really do add a huge amount. But thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, over to Anna.
I'd like to say how delighted I was to realise that this book was coming out. I had no hand in it and didn't know until I saw it. But it's got several of my favourite essays of Raphael's, which have been really quite hard to get at. Am I audible?
Yes.
Wave if I forget. I knew Raphael already in the Oxford period that you were describing in the 50s, although I was still at school, really. But I was going out with Luke Hodgkin, and he was at Balliol doing maths, but in the YCL, so he and Raphael, I think, knew each other probably from that overlap at Balliol, and it's interesting, I didn't remember him talking about Balliol as a cold place, because a lot of his Oxford memories. The thing is, well, Luke and I then married, I left the Oxford High School pregnant, and my mother had to write a letter to the headmistress saying, "Dear Miss Stack, my daughter has decided to leave school and get married." And she had to do it again 3 years later for my next sister, although that was a false alarm. and then again for the third of us. So we had rather a reputation of going to class. And I was moving in circles older than me, and Raphael was part of them. So is Stuart, so is Peter Sedgwick, Perry Anderson, and a lot of the early New Left, the first go at New Left Review were people I knew, and knew Perry because he and Luke had been at school together. So there's a networking going on even at that stage, in which I can trace. I still know some of these people. I can look back and see how they strengthened my dissatisfaction with school history. Another part of that was again Ireland, because my family were Irish via New Zealand, and they went from different people went from Ireland to New Zealand. My parents met there as students. He got a Rhodes Scholarship back. She managed to join him when her late parents' shop burnt down, fortunately. Oh dear. There was some suspicion, but I don't think she would have, because her books were in it. Anyway, the insurance enabled her to come to Oxford or to Europe and to join him. And I grew up, as did my sisters, thinking of ourselves not as English, but as Irish New Zealanders. And that in turn gave us a colonial a perspective on colonialism, which was not normal in most of... Well, in the left circle we were moving much more, but certainly not at school. Which was funny, because my father had a story from his secondary school in Auckland, run by the Marist brothers, the Sacred Heart. And they were reading aloud, I think altogether, from an Irish history textbook. And Father, what's the name, said, "Get out your pens, boys," and turn to page 16, and went on line 5 where it says, "In this year, the English conquered Ireland." Cross out, no, insert, "yet again failed to conquer." So history was already political terrain for me while I was through family stories. And I also had this amazing advantage of an intellectual understanding of the world, of the distance, of how long it had taken my great-grandmother Ellen Silk when she sailed to New Zealand in 1866. It was a journey. It could have been 5 months. They were actually a bit relatively quick. It was 4, and they didn't get wrecked or anything. But the stories told you so much about transport, about global relations, about what we could now call cultural baggage. That being New Zealand Catholic and being Irish Catholic in New Zealand, you were a minority immediately because it was much more Presbyterian and Scottish, let alone First Nation Maori with their own extensive language and culture, which was beginning to be recognised, but only just. Anyway, this is not strictly speaking about Raphael, I do recognise, but during the 60s, I'd got 3 children rather quickly, and Luke finished his maths PhD and then had what we now call a postdoc at Princeton in the States. So off we all trundled, going by sea because it was still too expensive to fly, but coming back we flew. And the following year we spent in Algiers in sympathy with its new independence, and because there weren't many newly independent places where highly intellectual, highly theoretical maths was usefully to be taught. But he was actually taking over a post whose incumbent was French Algerian and had gone back to France, whereas we were there celebrating the new. For me, it was awful. I didn't meet anybody practically. I got 3 small children. I got laughed at in the street. It was assumed I was French. Pied noir, and I wasn't. I was pied rouge. You couldn't very well say that to anybody who was jeering at the length of your skirt. Even I'd lengthened them all. Anyway, while I was there, I read Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, and we were going back to Warwick because Luke his new job was to be there, and new university, first year of teaching, and Edward Thompson was teaching there. It was almost the only university teaching he did was the 5 years at Warwick. And so I'd been dithering a bit. I was definitely going back to university. Would I do languages? Would I revert to classics, which is what I'd done for A-levels? Probably not. Would I do English? Which I certainly could have. But because Edward was there and because I thought the book was absolutely fabulous, I did history. Slight problem of access because of being a mature student, but I was very welcome, and there were other mature students. So I lived in my education experience some of the breaking down of differences between subjects, of connections between the teachers and the taught, and those were all part of what Raphael was also developing. So I think he must have been very pleased with sort of seeing me as an example of how things could work. And I loved being an adjunct to Ruskin, where I had already, from the earlier days, I remember sitting with Stuart and several Ruskin's students late into an evening, and suddenly having to get back because I'd got school next morning. I was, from 1970, Luke and I had broken up and moved to London, and Raphael and I started to live together, and did so for about 5 years, having some rather fine neighbours in Cardozo Road, Islington, 2 of whom are present. And in that 5 years, I'd like to add to the influences and say that childhood and our slightly eccentric family household were very important to Raphael. He turns much more towards relationships in whatever kind of household, and looks at different kinds of household, and takes much more notice of women. It's not that he ever entirely didn't. He was more aware than many of my teachers were. But I think that the fact that one of the first big history workshops was on children and childhood is one marker. Another one is family, work and home. Here are a couple of there's one programme. Yeah. And in all of them, in all of the subsequent, we've heard already that the workshop actual meetings began in the late 60s, and they were a way of showcasing the work of the students as making the point that you could learn from students. It wasn't a one-way traffic. And the Ruskin College initially didn't like it. They didn't like him taking them to archives. They said, no, they have to do their 2 qualifying years and then go to university, and then they can look at records. And I got pulled in to one of these research groups, and although at Warwick I'd done an undergraduate dissertation using some primary sources, they were really only the good Labour History Library, and I was doing it on the Social Democratic Federation in London in its first couple of decades, so late 19th century. And I'd been reading microfiche and all that, but Raphael said, no, you've got to come and come to the archive with my students who are doing this lovely work on common rights in Otmore, near Oxford. And of course I was back and forward to Oxford because I failed to remark that I'd grown up there. Yet, no, you probably could have deduced it. My parents still lived there, and I was often taking my children there and having lovely visits with my parents, but it also meant I could go to the Oxfordshire Record Office with this group and learn the excitement of undoing old ribbons around paper, usually, occasionally parchment, and reading difficult handwritings and thinking about what I was reading and imagining out the voices. And so I fell completely in love with archive work. It was quite good timing as I was just starting my PhD, which I'd finally submitted 22 years later. And it was no longer on girls' childhood, but the childhood of working class children in late 19th century London, and ended up as a book called Growing Up Poor, Home, School and Street. And so I was escaping the strictures of simply working, say, on education, because I was looking at what you learn at home, what you learn in the street, what you learn in the park, and how much else there is to education than school. And I could say at the same time, there were plenty of sources on school, but of course they were all provided from above by the authorities, with children as a problem, and education as a way of solving some of the problems of unruly children. You know, the 1880s, there are people around who remember the fearfulness up following the French Revolution, at least by a generation, when unruly populace are seriously dangerous, and therefore it's really important to discipline and domesticate children, and school is the way to do that. And this was one of the main reasons they did bring in compulsory school in the 1870s, and why girls got it as well. Because the usual argument in education history has been Bismarck and Germany were charging ahead and educating chaps to be engineers. Yes, there was rivalry with Germany, and that was an issue, but it didn't account for girls being included. And that's that the vision of educated boys was apprenticeship and different kinds of skilled work, and literacy was needed, but girls needed to be providing a next generation who were disciplined into proper domesticity and looking after their men, because it's also going with a concentration of the family towards male breadwinner and female housekeeper if at all possible, and if not, she's doing different kinds of outwork and homework. So the shape of the family is changing because of compulsory schooling, and it's changing in gendered ways. And that's the sort of vision that this is what I was discovering in the archives in this period. And because I was also in the women's liberation movement, I was, as were Sheila Rowbottom, Sally Alexander, various others of us, there was a lot of talking things through and relating the problems of the past to the problems of the present, or the efforts of the past and the efforts of the present, and thinking always about gender roles. And I think that both what I was bringing in that way and the experience of daily life in a family, which really Raphael had hardly had. He spent the war years when his mother was doing factory work with his uncle Shimon's family. I can't remember Shimon's wife's name.
No.
Anyway,
I can't remember now.
it wasn't. There wasn't kind of family domestic labour going on. I think there was probably somebody cooking and somebody cleaning, not on a grand scale, but there was certainly some domestic help. And then he was at King Alfred's. He was partly at boarding school, especially when they were evacuated during the war. Age 16 in college, again, no exposure to domestic life, and he learnt to cook while we lived together, trying to remember what his grandmother would have done, and taking turns a good deal, although because he was in. Have I got 5 minutes?
Oh no, just
no.
I'm just confirming it was Merrick.
Merrick.
Sorry to distract.
It's all right. That's what notes across the table
You're okay.
usually mean. And also, I'm rambling rather. No, but I think this domestic point is important. He was in Oxford 3 days a week during term, but back in Spitalfields in the house that he and Peter Maris from the Bethnal Green Institute that John referred to earlier, they bought together a house which in those days they were able to get for, it was £1,000 I think, and it was a Spitalfields weaver's house with a lovely circular staircase and one room on each floor and big windows to light the looms as late as possible. So it wasn't a very convenient house. It did not have any kind of heating except the oven in the semi-basement kitchen and a couple of paraffin stoves. You remember the shape of them, perhaps, which always stank, and I think contributed to my children's asthma, I realised later. But he did share shopping and cooking and some cleaning. They often ran a bit late, the way his writing always did. I think many of us are like that, a bit over-optimistic about how long something's going to take. But Raphael was generally, and it operated in the family as well. He loved asking people about childhood, and that was one of the sources of the childhood history workshop at Ruskin, was that his students had been telling about their what happened to Big Mother and Little Mother in Matabeleland. No.
It's not that one.
No, oh well, that's somewhere. Oh, it's here. So he had a student who wrote about how in the African villages where he grew up, some of the women would go to most of the women would work in the fields, and a few of them would look after all the children. And then sometimes there'd be reasons to be in the city, and if a child was going to secondary school in the city, they'd go and stay with one of their other mothers. And the big mother was the one who actually reared you, and otherwise there were little mothers. And you could go choose where you ate in the evening according to what stories are being told and what food is being cooked. It was very wonderfully fluid. Anyway, so this was grist to us feminists, challenging the conventional family. And it was exciting for just anyway to think of things that way. But that could go around too, perhaps. And it's an illustration of how open Raphael was to any kind of experience and anything you could imagine or learn from it or share, or how it could stimulate other memories. I'm currently having to downsize and leave the house I've been in for 33 years for a flat. So I'm finding all sorts of books I haven't looked at lately, and they include ones to my children from Raphael in his very distinctive spidery writing. And they're adult Russian novels and and Gorky's childhood. He didn't really notice age difference, which I think was perhaps also part of his having had this very curious set of experiences as he grew up, not particularly conventional. He was, and the progressive school will have helped as well. It disrupted automatic adult authority somewhat. On Ireland, I think he romanticised it.
Yeah.
It was very much. He was an extremely emotional guy, and it does come across in the writings to a degree, but it's a bit contained by his scholarship. But at the same time, the questions he asked and his responses to what he was finding out did have passion, and whether it was about common rights, and one of our pamphlets was about common rights struggles on Otmore in Buckinghamshire, not far from Oxford. Things needed to be fairly near it so as to be accessible for the students. They couldn't go rushing off unless they were simply remembering. He liked the fact that my children themselves became they were growing up as the workshops were happening, and I think it made the childhood one, if I did find it then, I may not have. There was a play in which there was a wicked overseer, which was Alan Hawkins, one of us editors, and a bunch of factory children, which was my three, Carla and Dan Mitchell, whose father, Stanley Mitchell, I don't know, people might have come across, was a Russian scholar, and Hannah Mitchell, their mother. Sheba Fombia, who was the daughter of Ilona Halberstadt, one of my close friends from Oxford, who and Sheba's father was a Tanzanian nationalist. So Sheba was brown, which really one of the things we haven't said is, on the whole, History Workshop was pretty white. It got better later, but to start with, there was the odd Indian student, one at Ruskin, who I've been struggling to remember the name of for 2 months now, but it will come. And a couple from Balliol and, of course, Stuart Hall. But it was rather white, and so for one of the factory children to be brown was quite nice. And they really enjoyed themselves. And Alan took off his belt and was chasing them round for some peccadillo. And they were yelling at him and making faces. This was all on the Ruskin stage, with audience egging on the children. I also wanted to say something about music, which is quite important in all of our activities, especially in the bar at Ruskin, all the year round, but also at the workshops, and round the table in Spitalfields, and later on my tables, wherever they were. If at all possible, an evening included a bit of, all of us singing, either singly or together, sometimes political, sometimes folk, sometimes goodness knows what. And it's interesting, Raphael's mother, Minna, I expect you may already know, but she had been a music student in the 30s, and it was had studies were cut off by her marriage to Barnett, who was orthodox and conventional and conservative, whereas Minna and her sisters were all party or close, and but Minna picked up music again in the 70s. She said to Raphael diffidently she really wanted to go back to composing, and would like to. There was somebody particularly she wanted to study with, Justin, I forget. And so for a birthday present, Raph paid for music lessons, and she just absolutely took off. And her first symphony was performed in Smith Square by the Society for the Promotion of New Music, and got lots. And she from that period in the 70s, she would compose for the next 20 years and became very well known for it. And I remember when we went to a concert, I think it was the Smith Square one, when people stood up at the end, finishing up, there was a group, perhaps this big, of small people. I was one of the tallest. And all of Raphael, I was amazed when you said tall, but he really wasn't.
Did I say tall?
I think so, but yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Minna was perhaps my shoulder height, and Miriam a little wider, so you didn't notice so much, but also small. And it was very interesting, this collection of Neosteins and others who were tiny, and the concert goers of London more generally, who were not. And it was just so visible. It was like going down Petticoat Lane. You could see the people who were coming because they used to live there, who would be small, and the tourists who would be tall. Again, that's off the point. I think perhaps I should just stop. I had planned to talk about all the other things that we did, but I think there's been an awful lot of us talking and not very much of any of you. So,
Well, I was just wondering whether you wanted to say something about the way in which the History Workshop operated, in terms of...
well, it was rather diffuse. There were quite a lot of family and friends, especially when it came to stuffing envelopes and well, the usual. I mean, people here are familiar with the co-option. of children in the political struggle. And also our meetings were held in our different homes, so children would be often listening, taking part. At the Children's Liberation one, or there was another one where the children themselves had written a play. As they got older, they started to speak and to contribute to programmes and to volumes. And that has continued in the sense that one of my fellow History Workshop editors for the journal, which is still going strong, it's going to be issue 100 next year. One of our editors for several years is my daughter Kate Hodgkin, and she also now has taken over what was my job for the last 20 years or so of copy editing and preparing. I noticed you have this role, but preparing copy for the printer and then proofreading, which is something we always took very seriously. We tried to have quite high standards, but we did also say no Latin, minimal footnotes, and certainly not arguments conducted in footnotes. So that thing about that thing about Raphael wanting it to be accessible. He wasn't always himself that accessible, but we did have. I enforced rules like that as I prepared the copy. I made sure that there were. If the word hegemony, for instance, was being used in the late 70s, it needed explaining, and so the new theoretical language. I was very careful. We couldn't exclude it, and sometimes it was useful, but I did make sure it was always possible to gloss it or translate it or whatever.
I'm just wondering how Gareth, Stedman Jones and Perry Anderson actually...
Well, Perry didn't write for us.
I was aware of that. That's my comment. The debates and footnotes. Thanks very much, Anna. Okay, time for comments or questions. Or anybody else want